May 4, 1945. A German staff car flying a white bedsheet out the window rolls up to an American checkpoint near the Austrian town of Wrgl. 3 days earlier, Adolf Hitler had died in a bunker in Berlin. 2 days later, and Germany would be finished as a fighting nation. And right now, at this checkpoint, an American tank company commander is being told something that doesn't fit any category the war has given him so far. A German army major wants to talk, and he isn't surrendering. He wants to fight. The officer waiting at that checkpoint was Captain John C. Jack Lee, Jr., commanding a company of Sherman tanks with the 23rd Tank Battalion, 12th Armored Division. And the man who'd come to find him was Major Josef Gangl, a decorated Wehrmacht officer who had spent the final year of the war quietly working with the Austrian resistance against the regime he technically still served. Gangl wasn't asking Lee for mercy. He was telling him that a castle 8 miles away held some of the most important political prisoners in France, that the SS guarding the area were preparing to execute them before the war's end could let them go free, and that he needed American help to stop it. He had already committed himself and a handful of his own soldiers to defending that castle. He was simply asking Lee to bring more guns. Lee had no orders that covered this. There was no manual for teaming up with the army you'd been fighting for, 3 years, 4 days before it surrendered. He made the call anyway, and radioed it up the chain as he went. If a story like this sounds too strange to be real, that's exactly why it's letting the fourth facts right instead of the dramatized version. Drop a comment and tell us where you're watching from and whether anyone in your family served in it. We're going division by division through documented World War II history on this channel, and this is one of the stranger ones. To understand why Gangl was willing to turn his rifle on his own side, we have to go back 2 years to a castle most people had never heard of before this week in 1945. Schloss Itter, Castle Itter, sits on a hilltop in the Austrian Tyrol, a structure with roots going back to the 13th century. After Austria's annexation into Germany in 1938, the castle was leased to the German government. And in February 1943, on orders connected to Heinrich Himmler's SS apparatus, it was converted into something specific, a prison for what the Nazi regime classified as high-value political hostages, prominent French figures too important to simply execute and too dangerous to release. By the spring of 1945, and the roster of prisoners held inside Castle Itter read like a list of the collapsed leadership of pre-war France, former Prime Ministers Paul Reynaud and Édouard Daladier, General Maxime Weygand, the one-time supreme commander of French forces, and General Maurice Gamelin, blamed for France's catastrophic defeat in 1940, tennis champion Jean Barotra, Marie-Agnès Caillot, sister of Charles de Gaulle, and men and women whose political and military rivalries had shaped, and in some cases doomed, France before the war, now sitting in the same stone corridors, waiting to find out if they would survive the peace that was only days away. As the SS Guard detachment abandoned the castle in early May, fleeing toward the nearby town of Wrgl, and the prisoners were left with no guards and no protection at all. And with the knowledge that Wrgl itself was occupied by troops of the 17th SS Panzer Grenadier Division, and some of whom had made clear they intended to make sure the prisoners never lived to be liberated. In a decision almost nobody could have scripted, the prisoners asked a former SS officer living nearby, Kurt Siegfried Schrader, who had a history with several of them and had grown disillusioned with the regime, to organize their defense. It was Schrader, working with an Austrian castle employee, who got word out of the situation at all and sending a runner through SS-controlled territory toward the nearest Allied lines. That message reached Gangl. Gangl reached Lee. And on the afternoon of May 4, 1945, a mixed column of American Sherman tanks and German Wehrmacht soldiers who, and 3 days earlier, had been enemies by law, began moving up the mountain road toward Castle Itter together, toward a fight that neither side had trained for, planned for, or had any real precedent to follow. And Lee's column reached Castle Itter on the afternoon of May 4, 1945. What he brought with him was not the relief force the prisoners inside had been hoping for. It was a single Sherman tank, nicknamed Besotten Jenny by its crew, a small number of American infantrymen, and Gangl's handful of Wehrmacht soldiers. Against an SS division reportedly operating in the area in the hundreds, this was not an overwhelming force. It was barely a force at all. But it was what existed, and there was no time left to wait for more of it. Inside the castle, the reaction was mixed relief and disbelief. The prisoners, former French prime ministers, generals, a tennis champion, the sister of Charles de Gaulle, had spent years being moved between prisons as the war ground toward its end, never fully certain whether the next transfer meant liberation or execution. What arrived at their gate was one tank and roughly 36 men, American and German, standing in the same courtyard. Lee made the decision to stay rather than attempt to move everyone out that night, and there weren't enough vehicles to evacuate the prisoners safely. And moving that group through open country with the SS active nearby carried its own serious risk. The defenders spent the rest of the daylight hours doing what they could, and positioning the tank at the main gate, setting up firing positions along the walls, and handing weapons to the prisoners themselves, several of whom, despite their age and years of imprisonment, chose to take up arms rather than shelter. That night, a reconnaissance element probed the castle's defenses, a preview of what was coming rather than the main attack itself. Gangl used the brief window before dawn to get on a phone line still connected to the outside and reach the Austrian resistance directly. And what came back wasn't much: 2 more German soldiers and an Austrian teenager who made their way to the castle to add whatever they could to the defense. It was not reinforcement in any meaningful military sense. It was simply more people willing to stand on the wall. The main assault came the morning of May 5th. Somewhere between 100 and 200 Waffen-SS troops from the 17th SS Panzer Grenadier Division advanced on the castle, and supported by at least one 88mm flak gun and additional automatic weapons, firepower badly out of proportion to what the roughly 36 defenders inside had to answer with. Machine gun fire raked the gatehouse. SS troops attempted to scale the castle's western wall using grappling hooks, and were driven back by fire from the mixed American-German-French defense. For a stretch of the morning, Besotten Jenny held the gate road, its machine guns doing the work Lee's small infantry element couldn't cover alone. It was during this fighting, moving between positions along the wall to direct his soldiers, that Major Josef Gangl was killed. The only fatality among the defenders that day, and the man without whom none of this defense would have existed at all. He had spent the last year of the war working in secret against the regime he'd served in uniform, and he died on his final morning defending prisoners of that same regime and standing beside the Americans he'd asked for help 4 days after the war he'd fought in for years had, for him personally, already ended in every way except the paperwork. Not long after, and the SS brought their 88mm gun to bear directly on the Sherman guarding the gate. The tank was destroyed. With their only armor gone and ammunition running low, the defenders' position was close to collapsing. It was at this point that French tennis champion Jean Borotra, one of the prisoners who had chosen to fight rather than shelter, made a decision that had nothing to do with tennis and everything to do with the specific kind of physical courage that doesn't show up in a service record. He got over the wall and ran, under fire, through terrain still contested by SS troops, toward the nearest sizable American unit he could find. Borotra made it. Running under fire, through ground that was still contested, a French tennis champion reached a column of American infantry from the 142nd Infantry Regiment, moving in the area, and told them what was happening at the castle on the hill behind him. There was no time to organize a large, careful relief operation, and the unit turned and moved toward Castle Itter as fast as it could get there. Back at the castle, the defenders were down to their last real options. The Sherman that had guarded the gate was gone. Ammunition was running low across a defense that had never had much of it to begin with. The SS assault, backed by the 88mm gun that had already destroyed the tank, was still pressing the walls, and the mixed force of American soldiers, Wehrmacht defectors, and armed French prisoners inside had nothing left to do but hold the line they had, and wait to find out if Borotra's run through the woods had actually worked. It had. American reinforcements from the 142nd Infantry, moving with the urgency that comes from knowing exactly how bad the odds already are for the men they're moving to help, reached Castle Itter and hit the SS force from the rear. Caught between the defenders, still holding the walls above them, and a fresh American infantry column closing in from behind, the Waffen-SS assault broke apart. Some fled into the surrounding countryside. A large number, roughly 100, in the tallies that survive, were captured on the spot. The battle that had opened at dawn was over by early afternoon. What was left standing when the gunfire stopped was, by any measure, an unlikely group of survivors. American tankers and infantrymen, and German Wehrmacht soldiers who had spent the previous 4 days as enemies of the men now standing beside them. Kurt Siegfried Schroeder, the former SS officer the prisoners themselves had asked to organize their defense before Lee ever arrived. And the French prisoners, Reynaud, Daladier, Weygand, Gamelin, Borotra, Callao, and the others, who had gone from political hostages with an uncertain fate to armed participants in their own rescue, in the space of about 18 hours. Major Josef Gangl did not live to see any of it. He was the only defender killed in the battle, shot while moving between positions to direct the defense he had organized on almost no notice, and 4 days after he had first decided to turn against the regime he had served for most of the war. In post-war Austria, Gangl was recognized as a member of the Austrian resistance, and a street in the town near the castle now carries his name. He is, and by most accounts of the battle, the reason any of this defense existed to begin with. The man who heard about the danger the prisoners were in and chose, with almost no time to think it over, to go find the Americans instead of simply looking the other way. Captain Jack Lee survived the war and returned home to the United States. For decades, the battle he'd fought at Castle Itter remained a footnote, a strange story that didn't fit into the clean narrative most people wanted from World War II, where the sides were fixed and the lines between them never blurred. It took military historian Stephen Harding's 2013 book, The Last Battle, to bring the full document account of the fighting to a wide audience, built from Lee's own after-action reports and surviving German and American accounts, and the records of the prisoners who lived through it. And the Battle of Castle Itter is generally considered the only instance in World War II in which American and German soldiers fought as allies in the same engagement against a common enemy. It happened 3 days before Germany's formal surrender, in a war that had, by that point, already killed tens of millions of people on the basis of exactly the kind of national and ideological lines that briefly, for about 18 hours on a hillside in the Austrian Tyrol, and stopped mattering to the men actually holding the walls. It is not a story about the war ending cleanly. It's a story about what was still true underneath all of it. And once the outcome was no longer in question and the only thing left to decide was who was willing to stand next to who for what, in the very last hours it still cost something to make that choice.